This conference will now be recorded.
And everyone is here. Commissioners' cameras are on, which is great. Do we have any changes to the agenda? Paul?
Just a quick item at the end under other business, if it's okay. I'd love to give you a quick update on scheduling over the next couple meetings for what you'll be receiving, and also share with you some thoughts on some outreach things, but shouldn't take more than a couple minutes.
Great, thanks. Anything else? Okay, open to the public for items not related to the agenda. Does anyone have anything? You can turn your camera on or unmute, speak up, or put something in the chat. Sandy?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to say that I have not gotten an agenda, which I can't, the one that Paul sent me, when I click on the links for the meeting materials, I get nothing. So I haven't gotten an agenda that allows me to look at the meeting materials. And that's why I tried to explain in the chat that I go to the committees page, click on the Plan Commission page. There's a whole list of dates and agendas. When I clicked on, that's where I normally get the kind of agenda that has all the materials. In fact, I don't even have to click on them. They're included. You know, it's the whole document. When I click on the one for today's date, I get last Thursday's agenda. And then the one that Paul just sent me does not have the materials included. And when I click on the links in the agenda he sent me, I get nothing. So I'm
All
just
right,
trying
Sandy,
to.
thank you for the heads up. It's a different person than me that puts it on the committee page, so it's possible that with 2 meetings in a week they loaded the wrong one. I'm going to send over to you the full packet right now.
Okay.
So that you have the full everything, and sorry about that.
Well, as you may recall, last week there was nothing for last week's meeting on that page. It said agenda 101, but there was nothing there. Not
I
even
had a
enrollment.
similar problem with Affordable Housing Committee agenda, so it might be a bigger 2021 problem.
Okay, it is all posted on the Laserfiche page, but I understand your that the link problem. So we'll get it sorted. Thank you.
What is the Laserfiche page?
The actual host for all of the materials that we have, including all the agendas, the minutes, all those things, is a separate website that we upload to. If you go to the Planning and Zoning homepage, there's a link right at the top that says Planning Commission agendas, and it brings you right to the actual place where we're holding them. So you can always get the full archive of all the historic ones, as well as all the current ones there.
Thank you.
Sure. And as I said, I'm going to attach the whole packet for you right now.
Any other items from the public? Okay, announcements. Did I tell you last week that I talked to the other paper editor? I feel like it was just so last week I had a great phone conversation with the other paper editor. Monica had kind of started that conversation, and then we had a conversation as a group. The editor, her name is Jessica, and she said that she would welcome articles from us at any time. You know, and she gave me the schedule of when we would want to get it to her just a few days before their published date. And I let her know that we thought we'd have something kind of talking about our current work maybe in the next month or so. And we would try for a quarterly submission kind of focused on our current work. And they were very receptive to that. So, and then she also said, like, if there were specific things that we thought were really interesting or we wanted extra coverage of, you know, she could assign reporters to certain issues. So if we felt like there was something we wanted them to report on kind of from their perspective, we could let them know. So I thought that was a nice offer as well.
All of our meetings until interim zoning is over?
That seemed like maybe not the,
Yeah.
Ted?
One thing, Duncan, not sure if it's just on my screen, but right across your face, it says Penny and then T. Does anyone else see that on Duncan's?
No, the penny T
I
is
see that
over
on
under
Michael's.
Michael.
I see it on Michael.
Yeah, right across from my screen, right across Duncan's. If no one else
Well,
sees it, it must be a phenomenon of my computer.
Penny T would be Penny Tompkins, but she's
Right.
downstairs on another's GoToMeeting.
Ted,
Okay.
try minimizing the screen and then making it big again with a little minus sign at the top right-hand corner,
Mhm.
and then making it big again. Sometimes there's just a little quirk. It's either that or Duncan just got a tattoo of Penny on his
There you go. Okay.
forehead. It's one or the other.
It just went.
No.
There we go.
You ought to let me know what's going on, Duncan.
I do have an announcement that doesn't have anything to do with getting a tattoo. There was the initial meeting for the Spear Street, Swift Street intersection on Friday. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend due to a work commitment, but they did put out kind of a list, a kind of a timeline and a plan of things going forward. And if any of the commissioners would like to see that, just let me know. I can forward it to you. I think we're slated to meet again in early February.
Great. Thank
I'd
you.
like it.
Monica?
I would like to see whatever I'm interested in Duncan's work
Yep.
there.
Yeah, no, I can forward you all the information that, is it Cy, Paul?
Me
From the
too.
CCR?
Yeah.
I'll forward it to you, Monica.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Anything else? Okay, anything else from staff other than what you had in the
Just a couple quick things, sort of a grab bag of council things. Last week, the city council did approve the annual budget for fiscal year 22 for voter consideration. Sort of the good news from it is that it retained the full budgeting for consulting work in our department, including things like what Taylor Newton is doing for us, the climate action plan, things like that. Unfortunately, there are a number of positions in the city that are currently unfilled, either ones that were vacated this year or ones that were slated to begin this year that will not be funded in fiscal year 22. That includes the city planner position, unfortunately. So that means you're stuck spending more time with me. So it is what it is. Council also okayed the Garden Street project to be put on the ballot as a TIF project. So this would be the completion of Garden Street up to Midas Drive and also the missing sidewalk in front of Healthy Living, which will be the next piece of creating the grid in City Center, which is very exciting. And Jessica okayed us getting, or you all getting a short briefing sometime in one of your next 2 meetings on what that entails. So we'll schedule that, and then you all and the rest of the voters can decide on whether to approve it for TIF debt next in March. So those are my 2 updates.
Great. Anything else before we launch into the first item here?
Where's the Energy Committee?
I know we have a few people on from the Energy Committee.
Keith is. Andrew?
Very good. So I think we have a few different people from there. Paul, did you have an intro? I mean, we had a...
Just briefly, and then I'll hand it over to Andrew, that the Energy Committee has been looking at some possibilities of a subject that I know you've talked about briefly in the past, which is solar-ready roofs. This year, there is a new commercial building energy standard that took effect in September of 2020, and it has sort of a different provision in it that affect solar ready roofs for you to consider. And so the Energy Committee met last month and probably before that a few times. And so Andrew's going to walk you through the slideshow that I shared with you. I also wanted to welcome Barry Murphy from the Public Service Department, who's joined us tonight. And thank you, Barry, for taking your time. Hopefully, at least it's a shorter commute than the last time you came back in 2016. But thanks for taking the time. And he's really here to be a resource for you all to answer questions from somebody who's a little closer to how all this functions than I am. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Paul. So I'll keep this brief. I know that you all have a lot on your plate, and thank you for your time tonight. Let me just mention, I guess Keith and MJ, also on the Energy Committee, are also here on this GoToMeeting, and welcome them to kind of add color as we go as appropriate, and also thank Barry for joining. So as Paul alluded to, we all spoke probably a year and a half ago about solar. At that time, we were discussing solar requirements for both residential and commercial. And just to kind of address that before we go forward, so for residential, kind of the stretch residential code is kind of overtaking things and now includes a solar ready requirement for residential already. So we don't really need to discuss that. And while a year and a half ago, we were also talking about possibly having a solar PV requirement as well. So actually requiring solar panels on that solar ready roof. I think subsequent to meeting last summer, July of 19, we kind of discovered it's awfully hard for folks to finance solar arrays through mortgage debt, and that because of that restriction, it's just something that in Vermont appraisers don't appraise the solar array when they appraise homes, that we felt it maybe just be too difficult to really get that done right now until that kind of piece of the process changes and works itself out. And so we're not going to talk about residential tonight. Okay, so just to focus on commercial then, I'm not going to take too much with the intro slides on this deck unless anyone would like to. I think it's very similar to what we shared last time, but just to emphasize, why we're here. We're here because we all know we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we don't, in a few decades or maybe sooner, we're all going to be in pretty bad shape. And we're seeing the effects today, right? So already in Vermont, and Vermont's not an island, but there's already negative impacts of climate change forecasted, we know, to get much worse unless we kind of move really quickly at this point to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If you want to flip to the next slide, because of that, the city recognizes, the council recognizes, we know that it's important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and South Burlington has pledged to do so. Unfortunately, I can't really tell you specifically how well we're doing on that pledge. The Energy Committee is working really hard, and with Paul and others, to try and collect that data. We all believe we're not meeting the pledge. We've pledged to be under 2005 levels by about 25% in a few years from now. The best we can tell, we're probably above 2005 levels at this point, but we don't really know, but we know there's a lot of work to do. And therefore, anything that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we think is important to do. So if we flip to the next page, again, not going to spend a lot of time on this unless folks would like to. Don't we already have enough green energy in Vermont? Not really, because to really get where we need to be, we need to electrify. We need to electrify our heating systems. We need to electrify our transportation. That's going to require a lot more electrical power than we already have. And there's also forecasts out there for how much that's going to require. But the Vermont Energy Action Network says we're going to need at least 500 megawatts of solar, which is a lot of solar over the next few years. And so this effort would be part of that. And as I mentioned, residential already has solar PV. We don't need to talk about that. As Paul alluded to, and Barry, who is the expert, can provide much more color. The commercial code was updated in September. And while we were hoping that the commercial code would, next slide, would have something about solar ready, in fact, it didn't adopt any solar ready requirements. What the current commercial code has instead is an appendix that municipalities can adopt. And that appendix sets out a solar ready mandate. And so what we're asking you to do is consider having the city basically adopt that appendix for commercial buildings covered by the commercial building energy standards. Just a note on that, because Paul and I have chatted about this. That's commercial. It also includes 4-story or higher, as I understand it, residential buildings. So that would be kind of the scope of the mandate if we were to enact it. It doesn't apply to all commercial buildings. The roofs have to be kind of situated the right way, the right orientation, the right slope. It all has to be, sufficient kind of solar insulation, so that roofs, if they're shaded too much, then the mandate won't apply. But if you kind of get the right building and building meets all the requirements, as I understand it, satisfying this particular requirement is not all that burdensome. It's mostly paperwork. It's mostly ensuring that the roof can bear the weight, which I think roofs and Barry could provide color wood normally built that way in any event. It's just making it easier, providing a conduit, having everything set up, having the breaker, having it all ready. So if someone wants to come in and put in solar, bing, it's easy to do. It's all laid out. Then I've included in here the actual text of the appendix. Again, these are not words. These are the Energy Committee words. This is taken from the Vermont Commercial Code. This is the actual appendix in the Commercial Code that is available for towns to adopt this page and the following page. So let me pause there for a moment, because that's kind of the first ask, is just to adopt this appendix.
Monica had a question.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Can you step back and clarify this request that you have to adopt the appendix? Is that for new, or is that for
new?
all?
New.
We're only talking new.
Yes.
And then just to be clear, because I think that, so the idea isn't requiring the building to actually install the photovoltaics. It's making sure it's built structurally so they could be put on in the future. Is that?
That's this first ask, Jessica. Next in the deck, we're going to get to the second piece, but at least first, the ask is, and you may decide to just adopt the first and not the second, or neither, but the first ask is just to basically adopt this appendix, which doesn't require solar construction, just that there be an area that's kind of all ready to facilitate solar.
So another question. So this one is not suggesting or requiring that a portion of a new roof be aligned appropriately. It's not getting into any of that.
It doesn't require a building to be positioned a certain way, as I understand it. Barry, correct me if I'm wrong. If the building is positioned that way, and if the roof is sloped the right way, then the requirement applies. That's as I understand it.
Paul, did you have your hand up too?
I did, and Andrew, this might be a question for Barry if he's around, but I just have a quick administrative question, which is, you described how not every building necessarily has to meet it, and I see the exceptions right at the bottom of the page there. Barry, if you're on the line, is that a self-certification like the rest of the Energy Code, that as they're filling out their paperwork, that this is something that when they file it with the town clerk's office, that they need to say, we didn't do it because we qualify for that? Or is that something that the local municipality would be doing, say, through the development review process to affirm that it, that it doesn't have to meet it because of one of these exceptions?
It would be on the local municipality to confirm that these buildings would meet the exceptions. Because this is an appendix to our code and not actually in the code itself, or not one of the code requirements, shall I say. That means that it's not something that we actually have included on the self-certificate. Although it is an option, believe it or not, for people to do this. We just didn't make it mandatory.
Okay.
So,
And well, I can follow up with detailed questions afterwards, but I might ask you in the future about whether you have recommendations about where in the process that would be done, about whether that's sort of at the development review stage or when they go to get a permit for construction. But that's a little bit too detailed of a question to ask at this stage.
Monica?
Sorry, I don't know if anyone else has questions. So I don't know why, if we were as a group to decide to make this part of the requirement, I don't know why in the CA 103.3 solar ready zone area, or maybe somewhere else, why wouldn't we require that X% of a rooftop has to be designed to somehow be able to accept it? Like, no matter the configuration of the building, a roof can be designed, you know, to capture the right direction. So why wouldn't we explore and see what the feedback from the community is on adding a requirement to have X% of a rooftop be able to accept solar?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Member of the public. So if we mandated this for all new roofs or all new construction, wouldn't that be superfluous for houses that are built that are in accordance with the new zoning regulations or the new LDRs or the new, sorry, I'm mixing up my acronyms, the new PUDs that don't face a direction that's optimized for solar? You'd be putting in a requirement that's completely irrelevant if they face the wrong direction.
We're talking about business
Commercial.
roofs right now.
This is strictly for commercial?
That's right.
Oh, okay, sorry.
We'll come to the PUDs because when we come to it, I have a question on that very subject.
Look, Monica, I mean, I share your sentiment to do that. Maybe Barry has a thought about why the commercial code, why it's set up this way in this appendix, as opposed to, as you say, in addition, the requirement that the roof be oriented and sloped the right way. I just don't know whether every building, I'm not an engineer, I guess, architect. Can you, is that something that could be accomplished without hardship? I'm not sure.
I'll take a stab at answering. In fact, let me turn my camera on so that people can stare at the awesomeness of me. Basically, I'll answer your questions in two parts. The reason why we didn't require it within the commercial code, as we were originally going to do, is we had intended to include this in the Act 250 stretch code, or stretch guidelines rather, that were to be updated. However, when we finalized this code, the Act 250 board actually decided not to move ahead with our recommendations for the stretch guidelines, which kind of threw some of this into a little bit of a tailspin, because it was too late to go back and change, because the process would basically entail going all the way back through the rules making process, including all public outreach, including everything else, which would have added an extra 6 to 8 months basically onto the adoption of this code, which was already delayed by approximately a year. The second part, and oh my God, I can't believe I actually forgot what the question was. Could someone remind me what the second part of the question was?
Why wouldn't we require
yes, the roofs.
new roofs to have it? Yeah.
You could certainly do that. It would depend upon the roof. It would depend upon the building. What you could end up with if you required that is a building with some very strange looking roof lines. It would really impact, or it could impact, the aesthetic of the building. It could impact how you could build the roof. In some cases, if it were severe enough, it would actually mean that the roof might not actually be structurally sound enough in order to actually take the loading of the PV system. Not in all cases, certainly not. That would be very rare. But mostly it would be the aesthetic of the building would be impacted potentially. Obviously, I mean, this code, this appendix, it contemplates a building that has a specific orientation on the north to south axis. And it encourages that the roof line, aligns with that. And in general, most roof lines on that axis would have a large south-facing area that would be perfect for solar. I hope that answered some of your question. Okay. Yep.
Yep. I have a lot of commercial buildings actually have flat roof here.
Yep.
And in any event, solar panels are no things of beauty, so I'm not too concerned about aesthetics. And good design, good industrial design or architectural design in the northern hemisphere, as in the south, orients roofs in a north-south orientation for the very reason. Not sorry.
Michael, if the building has a low slope roof, which I think, Barry, is that 10% or less, then this is in scope regardless of the orientation.
Yeah, I think it should be. We could make it mandatory. We could adopt this appendix, as Monica is suggesting, for commercial. I don't see a downside. I mean, from a climate change mitigation point of view, there's only an upside.
Andrew, was there anything else you wanted to point out specifically about the appendix or your request?
Well, that's the first part. So if there's no more questions about the appendix, should we move to the second part?
Yeah, actually, this is Keith Epstein from the Energy Committee. I have a comment, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
I wanted to say a little bit about why this is so important. A lot of times when the community needs to have more solar energy to meet our renewable energy goals, the topic comes up of not using valuable land for solar panels. And this is one small step that we can take as a city to ensure that more solar ends up on rooftops, so that the developed area gets used in a dual purpose for the purpose of the building as well as generating clean energy.
Thanks, Keith. Bernie?
Yeah, I have just a couple comments, I guess. Some more applicable to South Burlington than others, but in no particular order. So you limited it to 5 stories. I'm wondering why it wouldn't be applicable to buildings with more stories, although again, not too applicable to South Burlington. So just a kind of a question. The other question is any thought to retrofitting existing buildings? For example, in a lot of our codes, we say that if over 50% of the value of the building is going to be remodeled, then a bunch of other requirements kick in. So I'm wondering, if maybe there's an opportunity where, there's a major remodel being done on a building, maybe they're gutting it. And again, I think about the mall. I think about what's going on downtown with Macy's now, where they basically gutted it to change it into classrooms, where there may be an opportunity if there's enough remodel to require making something at least solar ready, because you've ripped out all the walls, so putting in extra conduit and stuff at that point doesn't seem like too big a deal. To Monica and Michael's comment on the building orientation, I get why the building maybe has to be oriented in a certain manner, but if a building has over a certain amount of square footage of roof, particularly if it's flat, then you could orient the solar panels where you needed them to. So maybe there's an opportunity to kind of address Monica and Michael's comment that if a building roof is over a certain amount of square feet, that then solar ready would kick in, because then the actual orientation of the building itself, particularly if it's a flat roof building, would be less important.
No, Bernie,
So-
just again, so if the building has a low slope roof, which, Paul, I think, was that 10% or less of a slope? I just don't remember exactly what the code defined that is, but certainly a flat roof, the orientation building would be irrelevant. That building would already be required to have solar ready.
Okay. Okay, so it's only on buildings with a
With a significant pitch. And
with
Barry,
a significant pitch that's oriented in the 110 to 270.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait,
All right.
I'm sorry. Did you just say that if the pitch of the new building is less than the 10%, it is already required?
It's I think 10% is the, I just honestly, I mean, I could pull up the code here and search for how low slope is defined, but Barry, do you know?
Not offhand, but that is correct. Basically, if it's a low slope roof, it already fits into this category. The orientation only really kicks in if it's like a peaked roof or no, a steep sided roof, such as you might find on some residential multifamily buildings.
But that less than 10% is still in this optional appendix, you're saying? It's not currently required for
Right.
commercial.
If we were to adopt this appendix, then any building with a low slope roof, including a flat roof, would be in scope regardless of the orientation.
I very much like what Bernie had to say, especially coming off of that whole remodel 50% plus conversation we had the other day on the other topic. So I like very much what Bernie was saying. And yeah, I would appreciate just including it for all new. So whatever the next steps, and I don't know how everyone else feels about that.
When you say all new, are you talking also about retrofitting buildings, or is this strictly new builds?
New commercial, right?
New commercial.
And then a discussion on retrofitting existing above a certain percent of redo.
Percentage change, yeah.
I would just put in one note of caution to that. That being, obviously, you would have to require under those circumstances that the roof be demonstrated to be able to take the snow loading plus the weight of the PV.
Yeah, there'd have to be a structural analysis as part of that for sure.
But I mean, if the commission's interested, we could add some language about, you know, just doing the evaluation and making sure it's structural. Paul?
Two quick thoughts for you. One, to Bernie's point, at least in the city center form-based code, we have a pretty good standard that speaks about when a building sort of has to meet the whole regulation. And I think it's 50% of all of the vertical elements of the building, basically 50% of the things that hold the building up. And that, if you're exceeding that, then that likely would take care of the note of caution that Barry is referencing, which is that you're essentially rebuilding the building at that point, like we've occasionally seen in properties where they've really taken a big chunk of it down. So we can take a look at that. I would recommend probably keeping, at least initially, the exemptions that are listed in here. Those were, I presume, Barry, vetted through, you know, thinking about unusual circumstances like, you know, exception 2, if a building was built in an area where there was a lot of trees that have been kept around it and there's no viability of generating solar electricity, that kind of thing. So those would be my suggestions, at least initially, to follow the things that others have put their thoughts into, especially if I'm going to guess, Barry, that we might be one of the first, if not the first community in the state to adopt this appendix.
To my understanding, you would be, if you do indeed adopt it, be the first.
Ted, did you have a question?
Andrew or Keith, what is there some limitation of how many panels would go up, or a minimum amount of panels? I mean, if let's say it was the Kmart Plaza, gosh, how many panels could go up? So what kind of criteria would you be putting on a
Right, so
building?
this first, the appendix that we're discussing doesn't require solar panels. It requires that 40% of the roof be
Right,
dedicated to future solar
Right.
panel installation. I'd love to get to talk about the second part, which is where we would like to then require solar PV on that area. So I don't know, Jessica or Paul, if we're ready to
Yeah,
talk about that.
go right ahead, Andrew. It seems like a good transition to that now.
Okay. So, now having this solar ready zone, which has the right roof, the right orientation, has all the conduit, it seems to us that it's not a big step to then say, okay, take that zone and, put as much solar as you can, reasonably. And the reason why we think it's not a big step is kind of twofold. One, when you do the math, the cost of solar today, if you put on a commercial solar array, you're generating energy at about half the price that GMP charges. So it's a no-brainer. It's an economic windfall. And all the commercial developers that we met with last year when we were vetting this requirement acknowledged that. They said, yeah, you know what, require me to put up solar because I want to have the incentive to do it. I want to do it. It makes economic sense to do it. And there was no pushback from any of those folks about a requirement. And we also think that it would be great for South Burlington to do that, to kind of showcase this and maybe set an example for the rest of Vermont, for the rest of the country. We wouldn't be the first to have commercial solar requirement, but we'd be one of the first. And we think that would just be send a really, really nice message.
Monica?
So my question would be, like, on a larger building, if we, however we say it, require them or ask them to make to put up as much as possible, I don't know if the business would ever exceed their use, if the solar would ever exceed the business's use. But if so, is there a benefit to the business in that case? Like, if the city required that they put up more than they need, what benefit would come back to the business for that?
Look, I can only tell you my understanding, maybe Barry pull up more, I can tell you my house, when I put up solar before we moved in, we were generating more than we used. And I was able to sell it to neighbors. Actually, I mean, I gave it away, but you could, right? It's your electricity, you can do with what you want.
Doesn't Green Mountain Power essentially buy that back? I mean, it's my understanding, and I could be completely wrong, and maybe Barry can step in, but my understanding was that when you installed solar or put in the Tesla batteries or whatever, that essentially you're generating the power and it goes out onto the grid, and you're basically getting credit for that.
That's exactly right.
Net metering, Bernie,
Right.
and Green Mountain Power charges 16 cents per kilowatt hour, but they only pay you 5 cents per kilowatt hour for the power you generate.
Well,
To answer the question is that if somebody put in more than their facility needed, that electricity would essentially go back into the grid and they would get a credit for it.
But
You do get a credit. I'm sorry, we own a commercial building and I had solar panels installed, and we inherited a number of solar panels because it was a former manufacturing facility. What I can tell you is that the rate at which you're reimbursed for the power that you don't use is a much lesser rate than the juice is not worth the squeeze. And so forcing that on as a small business owner and as a commercial real estate owner, I can say at scale, it's one thing. If we're talking about businesses that are over a certain size, sure. but for smaller businesses that are smaller in scope that employ fewer than 10 people, particularly right now, it's an onerous, it's a big ask.
And I just was going to say also, I think that the credits do expire with Green Mountain Power. I don't think that you can carry them over. So if you were like over a 10-year period generate more than you need, which I don't know when that would happen, honestly, because I think the larger buildings are going to be using a lot of energy. So it may not be an issue, but I just would ask that we look at what Green Mountain Power might be willing to do to ensure that credits do not expire.
I think honestly, there's two different things. And if commercial work like residential, there's if you don't use it, you can yourself carry it forward to kind of fill in holes when you're not using enough. But currently, you can sell your power to anyone you want, and work a private agreement with that person to pay you, and presumably they pay you a little bit less than they pay Green Mountain Power.
That just puts another burden on the business, though, if they have to also organize who they're going to sell stuff to. So it's just a point that I'm all for it. I personally hear the small business aspect, but I do think if Green Mountain Power would be willing to make sure credits do not expire, because I know like if you raise a lot in June, you can use it in January, but you can't use it the next June. I believe it expires by then if business is the same. So
it's also, Monica, I think extremely unlikely that 40% of roof space would generate enough more electricity than business use. I just think it's very, very unlikely to happen.
Duncan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, no, actually, Tyler raises a very good point. I mean, are there any dimensional requirements, size requirements to this code? I mean, it's one thing if you've got a building that's, 5,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet versus something that's, like the Sears building. I mean, is it any new commercial development, or is it somewhat scaled so that we'd say something that's, I don't know, 10,000 square feet or bigger? I mean, what is there a size at which it doesn't make sense below? I mean, Tyler had a good point. I don't know what size Tyler's building is, but I mean, it can be a very onerous ask if it's a small building and it's not really worth it.
I mean, yeah, I think, thank you, Duncan. You illustrated it much better than I did, but we all tend to think in terms of large scale buildings like the Coldwell Banker building or the Sears building or the University Mall. But I mean, what about the small mom and pop auto shop, or someone who wants to open a equestrian riding studio and wants to put up a barn? We're imposing upon them, if we're mandating all of this, we're imposing on them. Or what really scares me is if it's having to retrofit an existing building, because the costs there can absolutely skyrocket. And I think it's, again, if it's the scale and scope at which it's pennies on the dollar, or it's a certain percentage of it's less than a certain percentage of the project, fine. But when we're talking about a $40,000 to $50,000 retrograde or upgrade on a total project cost that was only budgeted to be $150,000 to $200,000, that's sink or swim for a lot of people. And for a small business owner, as well-intentioned as those are, that could really back them into a corner. They can't sell their building, or if they do, they have to sell their building for pennies on the dollar. They can't upgrade their building to allow for their business to expand because of these onerous regulations that are now being put on it. I would ask that we consider this in some way, shape, or form as we start to enact this.
Bernie, you.
Yeah, so just a couple things kind of to Duncan's point and to the smaller building point. Some of the language in the exceptions for the code basically say that if an engineer determines it's impractical, there just isn't enough space. For example, if it is a small building and you have to have HVAC on the roof and everything else. So I think that there's going to be a square footage below which you're not going to be able to go anyway. Because you're going to have other stuff up there, and the 40% just isn't gonna be enough to warrant it. So maybe the language is fine. Maybe that needs to be tweaked a little bit. The other thing is I kind of, I guess, agree with what I'm hearing in that I think making this optional, certainly making it so that on a new building, it has to be solar ready, but leaving it as an option to, you know, the building developer as to whether they want to install solar panels or not. At the end of that, I think having it solar ready and adopting this is as far as I would feel comfortable going. And as far as retrofitting existing buildings, again, I think, you know, to kind of address some of the concerns, if it's greater than a certain amount of square footage and greater than a certain amount of, you know, redo, then it makes sense. But, you know, if it's less than a certain amount of square footage or a certain amount of redo, then, you know, to Tyler's point, where it's just, you know, not economically wise to do it, we don't want to prohibit people from being able to upgrade their building because, you know, like he said, you know, you're doing $100,000 upgrade, but you got to put $50,000 worth of solar ready into it. You know, there's got to be, I think, a reasonable break even in terms of amount of redo and square footage that makes it practical. And, you know, maybe getting some feedback on people before adopting that part of it would be worthwhile. But certainly for new construction, I think doing the solar ready, I'm on board with. So,
Monica?
Yeah, I agree with Bernie. I would also say, though, that we have to remember that right now solar panels are big, but as the future, you know, as we move into the future, especially thankfully the 2021 future, we will see them become smaller. We were going to see roof shingles that can accept and act as solar panels. They will become much smaller. So I think the most important thing in a new building is trying to, as best possible, work on maximizing the direction. So whether it's you know, asking for designs with more flat roof or with a 10% that can accept the solar in any, you know, so even to Tyler's point, though, on a smaller building, it's again just asking for designs to try to maximize the direction as best possible. So so I guess I'm just saying, when we work out whatever we are going to do with this, don't just think about what solar panels look like today. Recognize that they and the technology can change. What won't change is the sun's direction.
well, and that's why making it solar ready is good, because then if the technology changes and the cost comes down and the size comes down, then what's impractical now may be practical in the future, and you want the building to be ready for it.
Michael?
Yeah, well, the costs are going to come down. They're continuing to come down. And Monica's point about PV tiles, they're already here. The individual panel will be the size of a tile, but the coverage will be much more extensive. The whole roof will be tiled with those, so produce more energy. And, you know, I know we have to think about the cost for a small business like Tyler's or my small business, which is my home. You know, I've got a lot more than 40% of my roof coverage covered by panels, and it doesn't produce enough for me for the whole year by any means. You know, in winter they're covered in snow, they don't produce anything. So a small amount of PV capacity is not great, but it's better than nothing. And I'm mandating is always difficult, but so is the future of our climate, the future of our planet. And we ought to have that in the forefront of our minds when we're thinking about this. Yes, we need to understand the costs, And I think, as Andrew has pointed out, a lot of commercial developers have said the costs are not an issue because they'll pay for themselves, which is great. So I don't have a concern about making it mandatory for new commercial construction. I don't think
I just want to echo. I think we need to really understand this cost question. When you look at new solar construction, it's about $2 a watt after federal tax credit. That watt will generate a little more than a kilowatt hour. Should actually generate more in Vermont every year. Over the course of 30 years, 30 kilowatt hours. That $2 is going to turn into $4.50 at current rates. It's an absolute win-win. It's not a burden to put solar. What people need is just a little bit of incentive to actually do it. It's not a net cost. It is a win, and the commercial developers we spoke with acknowledge that it's not a cost. It's not a $40,000 to $50,000 cost. It's a net win. It's a net savings. It's an economic benefit, and costs are only going to come down. That equation is only going to get better over time. So I would urge everyone to really think about the numbers here, to think about, is there really a burden, and to be a little bold in having South Burlington satisfy the commitments that we've made, right? That the city council has made, and also, what we owe to our children to, as we go forward.
There's a few questioners we haven't heard much for. I don't know, Paul or Duncan, Ted, if you had any thoughts or questions.
I think Bernie had his hand up.
Bernie, did you had your hand up?
Well, just to Andrew's point on the cost. See, that's what I don't know. You've said, well, it's a great deal and people are making money on it, but I like I said earlier, I would want to know if there's essentially a break even or whatever in terms of square footage or in terms of redo to make it worthwhile. So, I'm fully 100% on board with having solar ready be required, but in terms of solar being required, I would want to have some feedback, and I'd want to see the numbers to know, where that break point is, and if there's data, Andrew, that shows that it's regardless of size, then that's great. But I would certainly want to get some feedback from the people that actually have to, incur the cost for this to find out, where it makes economic sense. The other thing you mentioned was the solar federal tax credit. Well, as we all know, I mean, the feds change like the wind, and what's a credit today may not be a credit tomorrow. So, I think that needs to be factored in as well. But certainly, if the economics supported that, then I could say let's make solar panels mandatory. But I'd want to see the economics before buying into that.
So we are a little over the agenda item, so I don't know if we're going to come to an answer tonight, but it sounds like, from the feedback I've heard, there's a lot of positive feeling about the Appendix A or the CA, adopting the appendix for the commercial buildings for solar ready requirements. Is that generally, there's some positive thinking on requiring solar ready?
Yeah.
Yep.
But it sounds like there's some questions about the cost burden for requiring photovoltaic installation for those buildings. So it feels like maybe we could, Paul, maybe you have some ideas about how we could figure that out.
I'm happy to do some homework for you. I just thought that since we have Barry here, I don't know, Barry, if you have any thoughts on any of what was just discussed, including cost or any of the things, just before we let him off the hook. But happy to do some research and also talk with you offline, Barry.
Yeah. So what I will say is generally that your cost per installed watt for a commercial system is generally cheaper than you would find for a residential. However, commercial systems also tend to be larger than your average residential system. Most residential systems are about 7 kilowatts in size these days. They've been increasing in size as panels have gained efficiency and panel costs have gone down, so people have been installing more. Commercial systems tend to be anything over about 15 or 20 kilowatts in size, and they take up, I'm trying to do the math, about maybe 120, 150 square feet for about 100 kilowatts, I think it is. No, not 100 kilowatts, for about 10 kilowatts. So generally the way we look at it is there is a minimum size of system that's really cost effective for someone to install. We did look at those numbers, and I can probably try and find them and supply them to Paul when we were looking at the code. And we were exploring making mandatory installation of PV, including that in the code. What we have in the code currently is a kind of watts per square foot requirement. If you're going to install PV, this is what you have to do, and it varies depending upon the type of building, because obviously manufacturing is going to have a higher requirement than like a residential care facility, for instance, simply due to the energy demand of that building. But the way we scaled it is we scaled it to what we thought was minimally cost effective for people, to keep costs low, but hoping that when people looked at the costs, they'd realize that, hey, this is really cost effective to do, and actually put in larger systems than required by the code. What we were trying to do in the code is encourage people to consider the concept of PV, realize its value, and actually maximize and decide for themselves that they want to put on as large a system as they potentially can in the space they have within the budget they have, rather than mandate it. Because we definitely found when you're dealing with something along these lines that requiring people to do it can have negative impact, whereas encouraging people to do it by showing them how effective it is, generally they'll go far beyond what you might even think is reasonable looking at it yourself. It's a little bit of reverse psychology, I think, we are trying in the code in order to promote the PV aspect of it.
Can I make a comment? Does it simplify to say, I mean, there's the requiring that they install, which is to me a separate topic, but even in just requiring that all new roofs have this solar ready zone, in the CA 103.1, the general, it talks about these degrees, the 110 degrees, oops, and 270 degrees of true north. I think that's what we're saying is what would be good is to require that roofs find a way to have that orientation, period. Is that not that they would have to install, but that all new buildings have to design to try to maximize, and I don't know if it's those numbers or what percent, but that's just to clarify. I think the more
I would say that those numbers are if you're building a building, you're placing it on the plot of land and it falls within those numbers, then that's where the solar zone would kick in. Requiring a building to have a roof line that meets those numbers is a different thing, because then you can impact, as I said earlier, the orientation of the building on that land, as well as, and if they have to orientate it a specific way and you're requiring the roof line run a different way, it can impact different things, including the aesthetic. Well, not you care about this,
may not
matter,
oriented
but
to be able to do that.
Yeah,
I guess what I would say, Monica, is, you know, based on our history of buildings in the city, many commercial buildings choose to be flat roofs, and therefore it would be applied. Beyond that, there are some that have pitched roofs, and in this all sort of becomes challenging about, you know, if it's entirely a greenfield development, then there's some flexibility for how the whole thing is designed. If it's something like the next building at Quarry Hill Road, you know, the road's already there. The infrastructure is largely there, and so to a certain extent, they're playing with an environment. And so, you know, what a requirement for the building to have would basically be saying, then you must build a flat roof building, which might be okay, but you're starting to get an architectural design, and you know, that there may be aesthetic reasons that they were trying to be a pitched roof building. There aren't a lot of large pitched roof buildings because it's just not worth it to build a roof that big typically, but there are some. And Barry, the 270 degrees, just to understand that, does that mean that most orientations will wind up having this, and it's only really if it's sort of very north, or does it mean that it's a minor? I think I would need to wrap my head around that.
So basically, that orientation means as long as the north-facing side of your building is within that orientation, then you should have a good solar zone on the south-facing side of your roof, assuming that it's pitched. The exact degrees of it obviously would depend upon the orientation of your roof line, which generally depends upon the orientation of the building that you place upon the site. And obviously, the orientation of the roof to the sun also impacts the efficiency of the solar panels that are put on. You know, a true south-facing is not quite as good as a slightly orientated to the west, just minusculely. Actually gives you a slightly better solar gain for your panels, but anything within that zone is considered pretty much ideal.
I was just suggesting anything we can do that streamlines requiring that a good portion of new builds work within that, and if it means that a portion have to therefore incorporate flat roof, then can we see what the response is from people? It may not be much of an issue, and if we just set that, then, or maybe there's you know, maybe we can add to the exceptions, and if there's a really strong desire for a design to, maybe a design can be an exception.
Okay, Paul Ingalls?
Yeah, I'd like to see us support this. I don't see the purpose in frustrating the Energy Committee and the people that are working on this. I think it's for us to support and to encourage. The other thing I might mention too is that commercial development compared to residential development is pretty minuscule. Builders are building residential, not commercial right now at all. So I don't think we're taking any great step or making any kind of radical move by supporting and encouraging this. And I think we should take a vote on it so that when they go home tonight, they know where we stand. That's it.
Sure. Michael?
Yeah, well, just before Andrew and his cohorts move on, you mentioned briefly electrification in a general sense, rather than what we have today, which is mixed infrastructure of gas. Most places have gas and electricity. So new construction, which would be electricity only, would be cheaper because you're not having to lay pipes and install meters and all the rest of the infrastructure that goes with gas. My question is, you said it's unlikely we'll be able to produce enough electricity here to manage that, but this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It will happen very slowly. And wouldn't it be reasonable to expect that the production of electricity would increase gradually as well, and not get us into a situation where we're running out of power because we've built too much new construction, which is all electric?
I mean, Michael, I'll just kind of refer back to the research we did. This Vermont Energy Action Network calculated based if we were to electrify in accordance with where we need to electrify to meet the state's greenhouse gas pledges, in order to keep the grid carbon free, and looking to all the different sources of electricity, this group calculated we would need a lot of solar. I haven't done those calculations myself, but I assume they've done a good job in their conclusion.
And their conclusion was what? Sorry.
This group concluded that the state will need to add another 500 megawatts of solar by 2025.
That doable?
Let's start here.
I agree. Let's get cracking.
So if I might just add something to that.
Suggestion of taking a vote on this.
That's what I was going to say. Someone else was talking though. I don't, who was that?
Barry was asking a question, I think.
No, actually, it was me. I was just going to add to that point that the state has a net zero ready for new construction goal for both residential and commercial buildings to be net zero ready by 2030, which means that the Building Energy Code, as adopted in 2030, would be intended that with the addition of solar onto the roof, essentially that would generate all the electricity you would use in a year through net metering of some sort, or through the use of battery storage. We're still a way away from that, but that is our goal, and that is the mandate that I am operating under over the next 2 or 3 iterations of this code to try and achieve by 2030.
So it seems like the like an official vote to send it on to city council, we're not ready for that, but like maybe a straw poll kind of vote to just say we're in support of staff kind of making the official language up for us to vote on officially. So I guess the first piece was the appendix CA, so that's requiring new commercial buildings to be solar ready. So let's kind of vote on our support of that. So anybody in support, thumbs up or say yes. Okay, so I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that is unanimous. So we're all in support of the solar ready for commercial. So then I think the next piece was, Bernie, you had suggested having that same standard apply for retrofits for buildings that had over a certain percentage of remodeling done. So is there general support for that one, that piece? At least kind of hearing more about it. Thumbs up, or
is there any?
With
is
what
there a number that
back that up?
Is there a number that we're giving, or is it just?
I think Bernie
I don't understand Bernie's. Well,
Yeah,
the second one we're voting on is on certain size buildings, but what is that size?
But to be determined.
Yeah, I think it was just the general support of the idea, so we could get something more specific from staff, or maybe a specific recommendation from the Energy Committee, but just the idea that we're interested in learning more about that. So, okay.
Good.
So for retrofit, I'm positive. Anyone else? So Duncan or Paul, are you feeling like that's something worth exploring, or anyone negative?
As long as we can get some information on right sizing it in terms of that requirement for some of these too small. I'd be
Yeah.
interested in that information, yes. If we can get that in conjunction with it, I'm good.
And then I think the third piece was the official request from the Energy Committee to mandate the install of PV on those buildings that were made solar ready.
I think that was subject to Bernie's point, subject to getting a confirmation of the commercial viability.
Yeah, so I think I'm interested in learning more about the cost, just because I think that we're going to get asked by city council and others like what that cost is. So is there agreement on kind of exploring that further and getting some more information about that piece?
Yep.
Yep. Okay.
I would ask that, could we also get a thumbs up or down on the question of requiring the design of buildings to be created to have enough
requiring the orientation piece?
Yeah, and whether it has to be orientation or percent flat or something, requiring that new builds contain.
I'm interested in hearing more from, I mean, Paul had some points, and I think it might be nice to hear from Sharon Murray on that as well, because I know we've talked about encouraging that in the past, Monica, but maybe not a mandate. But
yeah, I'm just concerned that particular lots may not be oriented to be able to do that. Right. So, you know, I think there's some constraints to just, you know, a universal mandate on that. The code that we're provided provides some exceptions. So maybe that can be addressed as part of exceptions. You know, maybe you require it except if the land isn't oriented the right way or something like that. But I'd be concerned with just a blanket, you know, you have to do it, because Barry has brought up concerns, and I have concerns about lot orientation and things like that that may make it impractical. So certainly worth something to look at, but there needs to be additional consideration or exceptions.
Yeah, but it seems like that's something to add to the discussion, and it looks like Paul maybe has a comment on that.
Just quickly, a reminder that in the draft subdivision standards that you okayed, you did agree with the Energy Committee's recommendation about new lots being oriented to support solar. So, you know, you've cooked some of that into future lots. I think my concern would mostly be pre-existing lots or pre-existing streets, and you may find that you're starting to move towards really repetitive architecture. And I understand that there's pushes and pulls, and you know, energy is a really important subject, so I'm not trying to undersell that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, Andrew and others on the I can't tell who's talking.
Me.
Michael.
It was me. Sorry.
Michael.
Yeah, but could we ask, maybe Barry could provide us with some parameters outside of which it's not practical to mandate PV photovoltaic on the roof of a building? Is there a way to establish the parameters, or the other way around? When does it work and when doesn't it work? Because that would help us then craft the necessary regulations, and the exceptions would be, if they fall outside those parameters, then you're off the hook.
That's quite difficult to do, because it really does depend upon the commercial entity that might be residing in the building. Obviously, as I said, you know, a PV system scaled for an office, for instance, is probably not suitable for a PV system that would be scaled for a manufacturing facility. Within the commercial guidelines, we had a requirement that PV had to be installed on every building that was over 15,000 square feet gross perimeter, or basically had a roof that was approximately 15,000 square feet. That was really aimed at large box stores. I would probably say somewhere in the realms of anywhere between 10 to 15,000 square feet would be, and that's obviously roof area or gross perimeter area rather than internal space, because obviously if you've got multi-story building, then you know your roof area is going to be far smaller.
Barry, I was thinking more in terms of the building sits next to in the shadow of a hill or a mountain or a high-rise building, which makes it impractical for them.
Yep.
Because they don't get enough sunlight.
Well, that's the shading requirement that's included in one of the exemptions, that you have to have at least 70%.
I see the 70%. Yep.
And I mean, Michael, we thought was kind of the beauty of this progression was that once you satisfy this Appendix CA, you've already kind of determined you've got a good roof that has good sun, that's oriented the right way, that has sufficient space. So you've kind of already set the stage.
Okay.
And then once you set the stage, again, we're happy to then, go back and kind of reconfirm the numbers. But I think it's pretty easy to then, get, the numbers. Okay, how much does it cost then for a solar panel, and how much electricity will it generate, and what are the numbers?
Yep. Okay.
Okay.
No more from me.
Any other specific questions or things that would be helpful for next time we talk?
I guess just very to clarify what I was going for is a design should never, at least not consider how to maximize its solar opportunity. It should always have to at least consider how it could maximize, and if there's a design element or something that would prevent it. But any plan should at least require that they consider how to, get the right direction and everything.
Yeah, well, Andrew and Energy Committee members and Barry, this was really great and really helpful. And I think you really laid out a good case here. So
Everyone
thank
for your careful consideration. We appreciate it.
Thanks for your work, guys. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, so we are lucky tonight to have Sharon Murray of Front Porch Community Planning and Design with us tonight. Hi, Sharon.
Hey.
It's been a while since we've seen you, but we've seen lots of your great work over the many months. So,
oh, it's great to see you all again too. It has been a while.
Yeah. So we had another great installment of PUD items in the packet. So Paul, I don't know if you have anything you want to start out with specifically, or if you want to we should just dive in, or.
I think, just to set the table and as a reminder, you've looked at the master plan, you've looked at the subdivision standards. This is the third big piece of the puzzle. This is the planned unit development general standards. And then Sharon has also provided to you the first of the PUD types with it, which is the traditional neighborhood. And these all sort of fit together. As I suggested in the packet, what I'd really encourage, I know there's a lot of detail in here, but I'd really encourage tonight to the extent possible to get some high level feedback. Is it on the right path? We did flag a few key questions for you. Obviously, if you've got something that's burning in big picture, then please let us know if we're not on the right track. Now would be the best time to do that. But yeah, there's a few really key things that we'd love to really focus your attention on, and I might have Sharon walk us through those if that's if commissioners are amenable to that, rather than sort of going line by line.
I mean, I think that makes sense. Like if there's big questions, I think it makes sense to focus on them while we have Sharon here.
Okay. Well, then what we'll do is a walkthrough, and we'll pretty much skip everything that if there are no questions about it. This represents the first 5 sections of the PUD chapter, the PUD article. And it's been a long time coming, I understand. So we're still dealing with a bunch of moving parts. But just going through it quickly, page by page, are there any questions on page 1?
Sharon, what I was really hoping to do is to, if I created some notes in the sides of
Yeah,
the,
I have those too. I just
I
want to
just
make
want to
sure
be
there's
mindful
no
of everybody's time to not sort of get too mired in some smaller ones.
big issues. I just want to
Now
make sure.
we can send those other comments in afterwards. I guess it's page 3 where you're going to start, right?
Yep, we could start there. I mean, that is the first question. So we're proposing that PUD can extend over more than one zoning district. That's in your current regulations. The question is, given that the PUD is somewhat tied, not completely, but somewhat tied to the underlying zoning districts, especially with regard to density, I think that's one of the key concerns, is that how do you want to treat that across a district line? So there's a couple of things in here that allow for that. A would be extending the district regulations one way or another, and that's very similar to what you have in your current regulations for dealing with zoning district boundaries. The other would be to allow for a transition zone within that PUD or along the district boundary. The other option would be just to, again, a PUD is functioning as basically an overlay zoning district, a design district. So a lot of the things would apply in both districts because it's part of the plan unit development standards. The question is, again, basically density. We have a minimum density of 4 dwelling units per acre, regardless of which zoning district it's in. But if a district density is higher, then it would allow for a higher density of development in one. And if they're different, then that would vary how much density is allowed in one part of the PUD versus the other. So what Paul and I discussed was blending that and whether that's needed.
Sharon, just to be a little bit more precise in what we're saying here, when you say allow, maximum density is set by the building type.
Maximum, but the minimum is not.
Right. So when you say allow, we really mean require. I just want to be clear to commissioners here.
Yeah.
So if you decide that you want to, so part of this is what's the minimum that you want to set. And so the idea would be that if you were in a higher density district, like an R12, that you might have a higher minimum than 4 units per acre in that area. And then at the upper end, what becomes different is, say an R4 district might allow single family, 2 family, 3 and 4 plexes. An R12 district sort of from its base might allow a 8-unit building. And so the types, you sort of unlock new types as you get into higher densities. So the question is, if you happen to be, you know, I'll pick on the O'Briens, they've got part of their neighborhood in an R1 and part of it in an R12. So, you know, how much do you want to pay attention to the underlying zoning districts versus would you like to instead say, you know, as long as it's within X distance of a major road like Kennedy Drive, then that's what's important and the district doesn't really matter. That's kind of the level of feedback that we're looking for. Does that make sense, Sharon?
It does. I mean, it means that we would have to also vary potentially the building types by zoning district, which we aren't currently doing per se.
I had a comment that I actually wrote down for the TND PUD that you gave, but it kind of applies to this. When we're saying things like, let's say one area has single family, and then this is coming in next to it, right? So we'd have to be mindful of that transition. But I keep going back to this notion that you can make something look like a single family home, but it could actually house families. It's more the building type.
Right.
You know, so it's not always just the density. If we're going with building type, it can just be that you have to be complementary to what's there externally and then internally, who cares? You know, if it will still transition nicely if it, you know, does that make sense? So I don't know how to, if that's PUD specific or if that's helping in this, that it's not always just the density number, but the combination of the building type with the density.
Right. No, you're right. So, but the question is, again, the TND defines a certain, right now, a certain number of allowed building types. And so it does tie into density in terms of what the dimensional standards are in relation to those building types. So when we get to the TND, it's important to review what building types are allowed. But again, the question is also the idea of a minimum density. You know, as Paul said, if you have a minimum density in one zoning district of 4 units per acre and a minimum density in another zoning district of 12 units per acre, should that sort of be blended across that PUD, or should it be zoning district specific? If it's blended across the PUD, it could be accommodated. Well, in either case, it could be accommodated by, again, the types of buildings you allow within that district.
This feels very abstract.
I was going to say that I sort of apologize. I meant to really stick to the red comments first because I think that they're much more overarching and we dove right into a very specific sub question.
Right.
So that's why I sort of tried to color code these questions. But
yeah. I mean, ultimately,
if the feedback is that it's abstract, then I think we need to do some more homework to give you what it actually means.
Because actually, functionally, the zoning district boundary shouldn't matter because, again, the TND is functioning as an overlay zone. The only thing that's tied to it, the districts, are the minimum densities and the allowed uses. So again, Paul and I can work on that, but that's the only thing that would vary within that TND based on just the zoning district designation.
Would it be a stretch in the example that Paul gave in 2R districts to if the PUD straddles 2R districts, take the one with the highest density and apply that to both?
That's an option too. I mean, there are other standards in here that deal with transitions to existing development and neighborhood. This deals more with an internal boundary. So yeah, I think that could be a reasonable way to deal with it.
Okay. Duncan?
You're muted.
I had a quick question too, and I agree with Jessica. This is kind of abstract, and I'm not sure I understand these very well. But at some point, we refer to the PUD as a floating zone.
Mm-hmm.
If it is a floating zone, do the rules of the PUD supersede the underlying zoning? I guess I'm kind of lost on that one. If that is the case, then I guess I would think this would be a moot question, but obviously I'm not understanding that.
Generally, they do. But again, we tie the PUDs to zoning districts in part because of the development density, the basic development density. So again, the only two things that really rely on the underlying district are the minimum density. So if you're in an R1 district, the minimum density would be 4 units per acre. The other are the allowed uses within that district, as long as they can be accommodated within the building types that you allow. So it's basically an issue with regard to what the minimum density is across the PUD. And I think, as Bernie noted, a way to deal with that might be just to go with either the highest or the lowest, but in that context, you might want to go with a higher.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Ted or
Oh, I'm
Michael.
sorry.
That
I'm
was me.
sorry.
I'm
Yeah.
Michael. I'm Michael, even though it says Penny T. I don't know.
Penny T is Michael.
Mm.
And this is supposed to create simplicity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
What was this other down in red? You've got.
Yep, this is a threshold question, and I think you've had some discussion on already. Originally, we were directed by the Planning Commission that everything that's 4 or more acres should be a planned unit development. Some of the PUD types that we had proposed originally were 10 acres or more. The question is, do you want to require planned unit development for smaller acreages when you now have master plan provisions that could apply? So it would still have to be a form of planned development, but not necessarily a planned unit development.
I would be comfortable with 4 acres. And in an infill, it's going to be less.
It will actually, for example, for a TND, 4 acres is considered infill. The minimum acreage for a TND would be 10 acres in order to
Right,
meet all the
but
design
Sharon, I think what Michael is saying is that you could have a modified version down to 2 acres.
Right, but my
as
question
drafted.
is, because we're defining this by PUD types, that, again, these are basically zoning districts. Do you need to apply them to smaller acreages when you have also master planning requirements that apply to those? So in other words, and it's especially if you're not having a subdivision. So if you have somebody come in with a 4-acre parcel, they aren't intending to subdivide, they just want to develop on a portion of it. It would, right now, as it's proposed, would go through a master plan review. The question is, what value added would there be for going through a plan unit development review, especially if no subdivision is proposed?
Well, isn't that why we have the building types and the open space types? Wouldn't all of those specifics only apply in the PUD level?
They would, right now. But you would have the zoning district and the subdivision standards that would apply to smaller parcels. And a master planning requirement that you would come up with a plan for that parcel.
But you'd get all the benefits of a PUD on a smaller parcel if you went down to 4 acres.
Well, the benefits at that point are, again, Paul and I would have to work out what types would qualify. Certainly, you're right, it could be an infill PUD at that point, especially if it's within the existing service areas. But if it's a greenfield development, what type of PUD would that be?
None.
I have an idiot's question to ask here. I'm sorry. I'm getting confused about this element of master plan. If there's a 4-acre parcel and someone does not want to subdivide it, if we require the 4 acres for PUD, why are they not just going directly to the PUD? Why are they also doing the master plan if it's 4 acres?
A PUD requires a master plan.
And that's?
So it would, even if it was 4 acres, it would have to go through a PUD. It would have to also provide a master plan.
So then I'm sorry, what's the confusion then? If they're going to have to do a master plan no matter what. And then what's the harm of requiring PUDs at 4? I guess I'm missing, are we saying
Sharon,
that?
let me take a crack at this. Sharon, can you describe to the Planning Commission the advantage of why a property, like what the advantage of only doing a master plan of something between 4 and 10 acres, you know, whether there's a subdivision or not a subdivision? Like what's you know, what's the advantage of doing it that way? Like why would the commission consider raising the limit? The minimum?
Well, right now you require it. I don't, and for, I forget what districts, but you do already require it for parcels of a certain size in some districts. So one of the questions is how do you use that now? But the way it's proposed, again, if you have a large parcel that you're proposing to develop, the idea is to understand what the intent of development is on that whole parcel and not just necessarily the one portion that you're proposing to develop on.
Right, no, but I think, right, what I'm trying to get at is the commission is trying to, we're asking them to try to answer the question of if they have 8 acres, what would be the result of doing a master plan but not a PUD?
It would give them, I mean, they could even reserve a good portion of it under a master plan and say, well, I have no plans for this portion of the parcel yet. But it will give the DRB the opportunity to review the portion that they are developing, say for a commercial, you know, complex that doesn't necessarily.
Right, but they're doing that even as a PUD. So what's the advantage of not requiring
not
PUD?
I mean, it's like, say, the freight building that's going in. If that was going in on a 4-acre parcel, you could require a master plan for that parcel. And they're saying, well, we're building the freight building on a portion of it. This is where the access is going to be. This is where the landscaping and buffers are going to be under site plan review. And this would potentially only go through site plan review. But the master plan would say, okay, well, you have these many acres, you know, show us how you can connect the back part of that parcel into the front part of the parcel if and when you decide to develop it. And the master plan becomes regulatory, in this case, under site plan review, so that when they do propose to subdivide or go through, they have to get an amended master plan. So we're still talking about trying to address some of the thresholds that exist within the master plan section of the regs. So all certainly all subdivisions should have a master plan. Paul and I have been having an ongoing discussion of whether anything is subject to site plan should have a master plan. Currently, you require it in some cases. And that's why it was put in as a placeholder. But as it's written, subdivisions have to have a master plan over a certain size. All PUDs have to have a master plan. The question is whether larger parcels that aren't being subdivided need to have a master plan.
But we're in the PUD section.
Right.
I guess what I was trying to get at was, what is the case for why something should be allowed to just be a master plan and a straight subdivision, as opposed to a master plan and a planned unit development subdivision? Because otherwise, if they're doing a subdivision, the commission has already given the direction of 4 acres is the threshold for a PUD.
Right, and the question is what types of PUDs would that be? You know, again, it would largely be infill for the types that we've been defining. Originally, and this was a long time ago, I understand, but originally we had recommended that you apply it to 10 acres or more, because that would fit most of the types. And then we've talked about for the commercial, a minimum of 5 acres or more, in order, again, to meet the standards under that type. And then we were allowing for infill or redevelopment PUDs for smaller parcels that are within existing serviced areas.
Bernie has a question. Bernie is burning.
Yeah, so my question is just that if you used a master plan for part of a parcel, would that preclude you from doing a PUD later for like the rest of it? You gave an example of doing part, and the only downside I could see would be if you did part of it with a master plan and then somehow made it so that it didn't fit any PUDs if you wanted to do the rest, and you somehow hindered your ability to do a PUD in the future.
Well,
So
to be honest with you, that's why master plans are typically required sooner than later, because, you know, that can be addressed initially. Well, I want to do a, you know, I want to subdivide at some point, or I want to do a PUD at some point. But right now I'm focusing on this corner of the parcel that's right up against the road.
but they wouldn't have to say that in the beginning, right? They could come in with a master plan and not say that, and then come back later and say, well, now I want to do a PUD.
If they had
And
enough acreage for it. But, you know, and that's the point of trying to get them to do the master plan in advance versus just incremental cutting up the lot.
right, so the requirement would be when they did the master plan, then they would have to make a statement that you know, we ultimately want to use thus and such PUD in the future, but we're only doing this part now.
Right.
And that's what would get us away from messing up the ability to do a PUD in the future. But they would have to state in the beginning that we're giving you this master plan, but we intend to develop this as a TND or a neighborhood PUD in the future. And this master plan is a little piece of that.
Right.
Got it.
Would
Thank
they
you.
be, would
So-
they be obligated to do what's in the master plan?
Well, if you read back on the master plan section, it says that the more information you provide, the less you have to provide in subsequent reviews. If they don't have any intention for the property and they just have a big blank space, technically they would, I mean, they would have to meet the requirements that could be met at that level under the master plan.
And they would
should-
have to amend the master plan and get that approved later.
Right. And that's kind of built into this too, that you can reserve land, but then if you do that, it has to go through a master plan amendment at a subsequent stage.
The amendment would have to consider PUDs at that point, maybe.
If they want a PUD, right?
Gotcha.
But
Yeah,
is there
so-
the example I'm hearing is about like a piece of property that's not being fully developed at one time. And I don't know that that covers all the situations. So like, I think we're all really excited about the PUD and a lot of the really cool elements that they incorporate, like the open space types and the building types and block standards and all these smart growth development pieces. And we've also been talking about 4 acres for a long time now. And, you know, that's how all of our analysis has been color coded on our maps and, you know, with 4 acres being that parcel size. And I guess I'm wondering if we all of a sudden only have PUDs apply to the parcels that are 10 acres or more, like, aren't we missing applying all those great PUD standards and to those middle-sized parcels?
Okay. Well, I agree. And certainly where we started is different than where we are today, looking at the maps and the development patterns. Paul's been good about updating that. So we can, if we keep it at 4 acres, that's fine. We just need to, when we get into the PUD types, figure out how that applies to 4 acres. And again, for TND, Paul and I kind of did that, saying that anything between 4 and 10 acres is an infill TND.
Right. So functionally, what that means is that some of your standards get relaxed a little bit. So instead of having to have 3 different types of buildings, you only have to have 2 different types of buildings. You may not have to meet all of the requirements for the allocations of residential and non-residential. It sort of tries to recognize that if you've only got, say, 5 acres to work with, you may not be able to do all the things. But it then has you look in the master plan to that which is around you to identify the things that you don't have. Is that right, Sharon? Okay,
Right.
I'm comfortable in moving on from here.
We're flaming around.
Okay,
Yep.
Sharon, do you want to, the next thing I'd really love to get feedback on is the ways in which flexibility is provided, and maybe you can discuss that a little bit, and also the discussion of a point system. I think there's sort of a little bit one in the same conversation. So can you sort of maybe talk with the commission about how you've crafted, like, what does it mean to be, what is the realm of flexibility, keeping in mind that today's regulations, a PUD means like everything's up for discussion except density. So what does it actually mean here? And then what would a point system do, and what would the alternative compliance approach do? And that's basically all the same conversation, and I'd love to get some feedback on that.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, wait, Paul, what section did you jump to for that? Is that, oh, here it is, the E?
Page 5.
Okay.
Page 5?
Thank you.
I'm largely on page 5, but I also touched on page 6. So I'm sort of wrapping it all into one discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this has been a real challenge because, as you know, the PUD project started in part because the PUDs are just basically used as a waiver provision, not just in South Burlington, but in a lot of communities. So we're trying to get back to the idea that no, planned unit development is a planned development with its own standards. So each of the types have standards attached to them. They also, again, reference some of the underlying zoning, mainly with regard to density and use. The question that Paul and I have had for you is how much flexibility within that framework does a planning commission want to provide? The first thing we did was if you look at the TND standards, there's a range. There's definitely standards there, dimensional standards, but they're presented as ranges, minimums and maximums. So that's one form of flexibility, that there's a range of dimensions that you can meet, not just one. There's also a range of building types, street types, and civic space types. So there's a menu of options for those, and that's intended, again, to provide some flexibility. But with regard to the design standards for a PUD, and again, you can think of these in terms of what we provided for the traditional neighborhood development, there's a question of how much flexibility in those standards, which really are basic to the type of development you're trying to achieve, how much flexibility should be given within that. Certainly, you know, if you're dealing with physical site constraints, we all recognize that there needs to be some way to address that. And that really goes back to the subdivision regs and the standards in there for that kind of modification. But within the TND standards, and especially the design standards, like a lot of the things that are structured around walkability, having sidewalks on both sides of the streets, or, you know, some of the things that are other things we flagged for discussion, you know, are those specific requirements that have to be met, or do you want to provide more flexibility? And Paul and I, based on our discussion about that, decided, well, they really are standards because, again, they're integral to that PUD type. You know, those standards are basically across the board representative of what's typically in a traditional neighborhood development regulation. That said, you know, looking at, we did some outside research, and again, as Paul noted, this isn't common in Vermont, but there's also elsewhere a provision for alternative forms of compliance. So that section on alternative forms of compliance, it's not an exemption. It's not even really a waiver. It's just saying the developer can come in with a proposal under one of those design standards with another way to comply with basically the concept of a TND. So in reviewing that, you know, again, they're coming in with an alternate proposal. The standard then becomes what's the intent and the descriptive elements of a traditional neighborhood development. So that becomes the basis for the the DRB to review the alternative that's proposed. And again, that I'm not sure. I've borrowed this from colleagues elsewhere outside of Vermont. I think it's legitimately allowed under Chapter 117, but it's one of the things I flagged for Paul to get a legal review on too, because it's not specifically enabled in statute to allow for that.
So that's one approach. Another approach that we did a little bit of a mocking up on is to have it be points based.
Right.
That you have to meet a certain number of points. The points system would set some things that have to happen, and then would say, you have to achieve 100 points, and would provide a little bit of flexibility in terms of, somebody saying, boy, to be marketable, I'm really, I really think that I need to have, I can't really do an alley loaded neighborhood, so I'd like to do front facing garages. Maybe you get fewer points for that, but in exchange, I can, or not in exchange, but I can make up my points by having the neighborhood be net zero. I'll just pick 2 subject areas. And, so the pro of that is that it does allow the city to give some very specific guidance about things that you can, where you can sort of do, good, better, best. The con of it is that it's a fair amount of work to set this up and to calibrate right. And Sharon and I were just talking a week and a half ago about this sort of push and pull of having really good PUD standards and also being done in a timely manner. And the point system is tricky.
It is. I mean, it's similar to, if some of you are familiar with the LEED system for buildings and neighborhoods, it's very similar to that. You assign points to different values or different criteria. And there's an example in there from a parking, parking access, I think on.
It's in the TND section at the end.
Yeah, it's way in the back on
All
page
right.
7 in the back. Yeah, but there is an example in there of a potential way to deal with that.
Michael, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of torn between these 2 ideas, because if we allow too much flexibility under what's on page 5, then we're going to lose the look and feel of the PUDs that we've tried to prescribe or describe. We had this chart and pie charts and all the rest of it, and now we're kind of I've lost track of that. So if you allow flexibility in the comment to PC 13, you're going to lose the look and feel of what we wanted in the first place. On the other hand, if you go to the next page about alternative compliance, that seems to me to be a good thing, because it would encourage innovation in design and encourage it and allow it. So I don't know where to go, where we should go. And on the point system, the example that you gave, Paul, of net zero in exchange for garages facing the street, that's not a good idea either. I don't know how the point system would work, because a developer could choose the easier thing to do, but we might lose the aesthetics that we are trying to achieve in the design of these PUDs. So,
and that's a fair point, Michael, and that's the challenge of calibrating this to be, to make sure that all the outcomes are good outcomes. So I wholeheartedly hear your point there.
Right. And I think, as Paul mentioned, there's a minimum that would have to be met, and that's the question. Where is that minimum going to fall under each of those criteria?
Anyone else have thoughts on this? Monica?
I see that Sandy Dooley is listening in. I don't know if she's there. I'm probably catching her off guard, but if this helps, and it kind of relates, there was a discussion in the Affordable Housing Committee about asking us and the city to prioritize the things that are most important to us in each PUD, and what things have to happen right away versus what things can happen down the road. And one example is because the developers are working within these constrained budgets as well, of course, as we're doing all of this. If we're prioritizing things like certain solar this, and also if inclusionary housing is included in all the PUDs, and then we want connectivity with bike paths, but maybe, what's the priority if they have an option to put some of it off? And one example might be, well, bike paths, as long as they know on their master plan where they're going to go, do they have to complete the bike paths from the get-go? So if that kind of prioritization helps with the points, it might be mandates that you have to do, but in what order? I don't know if Sandy can explain it better, and I don't know if that helps or just confuses this.
Bernie?
I was just going to say that I think I like the alternative approach. I think I'm hearing that, in terms of the point stuff, that it may be hard to set up and calibrate, and that you could end up having unintended consequences. Whereas the language of the alternatives, kind of points in a certain direction that, you have to meet the intent. And if you're not going to meet the intent, you come up with something that's better. Right. And I agree with Michael, that allows for some, innovation, but still requires that people kind of remain within the overall boundaries of the intent of a PUD. So I kind of like that approach.
Yeah.
It sounds like some support for kind of what's written in here, not going with the point system. Unless, Duncan, did you have some?
Yeah, I'm not against it, but I think it would be very difficult to implement fairly and equitably.
Yeah, let's hear. Duncan, I think you have a hand up, but everybody's a little frozen, so it's hard for me to always tell. So.
No, I had a kind of a simple question, just backing up a little bit. You mentioned modifications. I understand waivers and other relief, but you mentioned modifications and then alternative compliance. I'm just trying to figure out what's the difference between those two. And I agree with Michael's point about not diluting the PUD with a bunch of waivers and stuff, but I guess, can you explain that to me, Paul? Or Sharon?
I'm going to have Sharon take this one. Sharon, can you describe the difference between a modification, a waiver, and an alternative compliance?
We're talking alternate compliance, and modifications seem to be fairly similar to me.
They are. And to be honest with you, that's a fair point, that we should probably clean up the language or be more specific. In Vermont, the PUD provisions typically address modifications and waivers. And I think your current LDRs reference that too. We're really trying to get away from waivers. So the question is, how do you substitute for that? The modifications are typically things like when you do have physical site constraints and you have to allow for some modifications in the design. The alternative compliance is just saying, in lieu of a waiver, I can't meet this specific, or I don't want to meet this specific criteria. I want to substitute this instead, which I think will work better. So instead of maybe having a sidewalk on two sides of a street, you have a rec path on the other one because it's connected to the rec path system. Or, I can't make a central green here, but I'm going to make two greens relatively centrally located that are connected because of whatever constraints we have in that area. That will
Or
serve.
there's a really beautiful viewpoint that's not right in the middle, but it would be really a spectacular gathering place for everybody in this neighborhood, even though it's
Right.
not right in the heart. Sharon, maybe a way to think about it is a modification is almost an accommodation,
Mhm.
to
point.
something that we can't foresee, like, there's some industrial use right next to it that is really kind of, noxious that you wouldn't want to be right up against. And so you give a little bit of flexibility that isn't about necessarily better design. It's just accommodating something that the regulations didn't contemplate. Is that sort of a way to think about a modification?
And then, yeah, and I think in that context, it also applies to the transition provisions, transition zone provisions. The meeting quite a while ago, we spent a good chunk of the Planning Commission meeting talking about the need to be able to deal with transition areas. So those modifications could include things, and they're listed in that section, like lot averaging. And I think Paul had a good example of a block where you did that a few meetings ago, where you take lot size, you average lot sizes, building heights, things like that. You basically modify the standards within that zone so that somebody's got a call. So you can make the transition from a higher density to, say, a lower density. So those would be sort of modifications within that zone that would be allowed under that to accommodate that transition in form.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're struggling with, why couldn't we leave out E altogether on page 5, where you have the question about flexibility, and just use the alternative compliance mechanism to cover the requested modifications? Because that, then whoever's doing the project has to use some imaginative design to satisfy this alternative compliance requirement. So why bother with E on page 5?
Yeah, actually, I guess I almost thought that E, so that at the top of page 5, there's like 5 things listed, A, B, C, D, E. And then below that, then there's the general standards on the bottom of 5, and then the next page, it's almost like each of those things at the top of 5 are then like referring down to the section below.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like that E, at least to me, is like pointing down at the alternative compliance.
I took it a little different. I think Paul put it in as a placeholder.
Submission. Sorry, go ahead, Bernie.
No, I was just going to say that E, it seemed like Paul kind of put that in as a placeholder, that it kind of reads going from, kind of the top of page 5 down into the 15C04, and then going on down through alternative compliance. So it almost seemed like that E was a placeholder.
It is. And it was reserved because we spent a lot of time talking about the point system. But, as Paul noted, we would have to recraft some of the general standards to follow that format. And that's what would take the time. But
if you pulled out that E, then everything else would make sense with the alternatives. Right. Yeah.
And you could leave it, you do leave LDRs, you have reserved sections in your LDRs now in case you ever want to adopt a point system format for this. But you're right. I mean, the intent was to be able to just take that out if you wanted to go that route. So you're right, you would just delete E in that case.
Okay, well, Ted?
No, I agree. I like the alternative compliance. I have one question above the C2, and it says that it says unless modified or waived by the DRB, consultation with city or state officials. Now, who would be the city official we're referring to?
It's typically the public works guys or the fire department, to be honest with you. They're the ones that often have competing standards. At the state level, it would normally be V-Trans for anything on a state highway system. And
Okay.
there might be some other.
I have the same question on that, you know, not only there, but in number 2, unless modified or waived by the DRB. In number 1, is not superseded, modified, or waived by the DRB. In A down 2A, unless modified or waived by the DRB. They don't want that. The DRB has told us quite clearly that we shouldn't put them in a position where they have to do waivers. The LDRs have to be clear, cut and dried, so that they can interpret them without having to think about waivers. So it's just a question. I don't know whether it's a valid one, but I had made a note of it.
Okay, well, I mean, again, originally I went through and struck out wherever it referenced waiver or waived, but again, realized that in some cases they may want to retain that authority again to meet public health standards or other, you know, again, some of the stuff that we addressed under the subdivision regs.
I think
but
maybe
that said, a PUD goes through subdivision reviews, so it would apply anyway in that context. So
I think what I'm hearing is feedback, Sharon, and I think you and I have talked about this offline as well, is if the term waiver is going to be used, then we need to narrow it very precisely to the circumstance, you know, conflicting with a otherwise adopted city regulation, or, you know, very specific to something. I think that's what I'm hearing from commissioners, is that it maybe comes across a little bit too broadly.
Okay.
Yeah, I like Duncan's oft repeated question, give us an example. So, you know, that would narrow it down if you provided the circumstances in which a waiver might be allowable. As you say, narrow it down.
Okay.
Well, those were my big questions, and essentially the other questions, even in the traditional neighborhood, were sort of offshoots of that same question.
Mm-hmm.
The secondary questions, which you know, I recognize that it's 9:10. I'm happy to follow up post Sharon about. I know that the commission has you know, been discussing, do you want to apply a minimum density in a conservation PUD or not? They're sort of they're important questions, but they're a couple steps lower. I did want to take the opportunity while Sharon is here, though, of you know, do you have any broad questions about, you know, how a TND functions, how this all comes together? The look of those and feel of those neighborhoods is sort of a package that Sharon's put together, and you know, I think being, yeah, if commissioners have questions, even just general ones of how does this work and what's this mean, this would be a great time to ask her.
Well,
Jessica,
I guess
is your screen struggling, or are you?
maybe. I think it's why I keep missing when they have their hands up.
I have a question.
I'm here and I can hear, but I can't always, people's hands get stuck. I guess
Ted
I
and
had
Duncan are both.
I have an overarching question while I'm talking now. For resource land, is there a reason why we would need to have a maximum? And it's really just a question, and I see that that's you know, one of the things in red here.
The maximum under the TND?
Yeah.
Again, that relates to land use allocation. And it basically was based on a discussion, especially around the forest blocks. Paul and I have been going back and forth. Typically, you wouldn't have resource lands in a TND. You wouldn't have farmland or conservation land or all that. You could have it adjoining that. But again, a TND is supposed to be a traditional neighborhood, so it's largely residential. And the land use allocations, that's where the pie charts were. They translated into those percentages in the district or the TND table. So those land use allocations are very much geared towards residential development, civic space, that shared civic neighborhood space, and with the expectation that you're creating higher density neighborhood development. And so within that context, you wouldn't have a lot of resource land. Occasionally, if your parcel has resource land on it, and you can incorporate that as open space or a form of, again, an alternate form of compliance. Well, we want to put, instead of putting up a green or a pocket park here, we're going to provide paths into the woods.
So
we
Sharon,
decided to include that as an option to allow for if that does exist on the property. But
so
it's
Sharon,
not one of the basic forms of land use within that PUD type.
as I recall, Sharon, there's nothing prohibiting somebody from being two PUDs or a PUD and potentially a master plan that involves other lands. So if you had, let's say, 40 acres, you could have a 10-acre conservation PUD wherein it's all resource land, and then a 30-acre TND, correct?
Or you could have, yeah, I mean, if you have enough acreage, you could have two different types of PUDs. And another example is having a neighborhood development with a core that's more of a neighborhood commercial.
Right, but I was trying to specifically answer Jessica's question about
Right.
resource land. If you wanted to dedicate more land to resource, you could just not. You said it wouldn't typically be in a TND. You could assign it
Right.
to something else.
You could. This is for an option if you don't have enough land to do that, but you want to be able to accommodate something on it. Originally, if you look at the pie charts, there was no percentage for resource land at all. But that was based on a discussion around forest blocks and stuff to allow for at least a portion of that to be included.
And I think we heard some feedback of, if somebody wanted to put together a working apple orchard in the middle of their PUD, then why not encourage that kind of sustainable agriculture in our community?
Right.
Duncan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think I flunked density. I'm still having an issue, and I know, Monica, I think you raised this too, with building types and density, the maximum density with building types. I guess, is there a simple layman's term way to explain that? I apologize, maybe I'm a little simple on that front, but I'm still not quite sure on how that, with the building types and the density works, with maximum.
I don't understand it either.
I'm not the only one flunked.
Well, there is the minimum density, and I think you've already had some discussions about that, and that's actually something in our meetings with developers we're very supportive of, because it helps them deal with some of the NIMBY issues around housing development. But in terms of a maximum density, if you go with building types, so for instance, if your minimum density is 4 units per acre, that could be 4 single family homes. If you allow single family homes as a building type, it could be two duplexes if duplexes are allowed as a building type, or it could be 1 quadplex, 1 small multifamily. So each of those contains 4 units, but within different building types. That said, that once you define the minimum density, so that gives the developer an idea of what would meet that minimum density. The maximum density is based on the allowed building types or the building types you allow within that PND. So if you're requiring a mix of, say, 3 different housing types, some of those are single family, some of those are duplexes, and some might be quads. The ratio in that, in terms of meeting that mix with the different building types, will define what the overall density of that development is. So there's not necessarily a set maximum density, except how you define it in relation to the housing mix and the building types you allow.
And so,
In the PUD,
say that again, Duncan?
those ratios that Sharon described, those would come from the individual PUD regulations.
Right.
Correct. So let me walk through an example, because you always like having an example here. A traditional neighborhood might say that there's a range of how much can be residential, but let's say of your buildable land, 70% is going to be residential. 10 or 15% might be open space, 10 or 15% might be non-residential in some way. But so you start with the 70%. And so let's say on a 10-acre parcel, or 10 buildable acres, that's 7 acres. Within that, you'll have a requirement for a couple of building types, and the building types each bring with them their own minimum and maximum lot sizes. So for a single family home, the minimum might be, I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say it's 5,000 square feet and the maximum is 10,000 square feet. So if every developer decided to build a single family homes on the largest lot size they could, then you'd get 10,000 square feet times, let's say that's allowed to be half of all the development. So 10,000 square feet times 3.5 acres, that's the number, that's the density on that side. And then maybe you choose to be duplexes for the other half, and those have their own lot sizes. And that becomes your output of density. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then you might choose to say, oh, actually, I want to throw some triplexes in here, or I would like to try some smaller single family homes. And so then you wind up getting a little bit more density because you're choosing to build a smaller lot size. If you build a smaller lot size, you may also have some other things that come in, like the smaller your lot gets, the more you're going to have to likely be a rear loaded garage. At some point, you're not going to be able to do it by a shared front ones. And so there might be a little bit more cost on infrastructure, but that's okay because you're making it up with more compact housing. Does that sort of answer the question? I've charted out for the Southeast Quadrant some estimates around this. I would say that generally speaking, Sharon, if you talk about only the buildable acreage, and then you talk about only the residential portion of it, you wind up with sort of a net in a TND of somewhere between 8 and 15 units an acre winds up being your maximum. Is that fair, Sharon, as a rough as a rough number? Does that help? But again, that's the net of the net. So that's after you've taken out all the resources. It's after you've taken out your open spaces. It's after you've taken out your roads. The net land winds up being about 8 to 15 units an acre. And that's the calibration of deciding how much you want to allow for triplexes and fourplexes versus single families and twos.
But again, it's also a way to provide that flexibility in terms of the housing market, in terms of, topography and site conditions. And so.
I had a question along that line. Looking at page 9, and at the top of page 9, it says the DRB may allow, and then it continues on. And my question is that it allows the DRB to, I guess, increase the height, if I'm reading that correctly. So is there a limitation? I mean, are we conceivably, when we're talking about this density of 8 to 15 units, is it conceivable we'd have 4 or 5 stories in the Southeast Quadrant?
Not in a TND. There's height limits defined in that table in stories, and I think the maximum would be 3. I forget. I'd have to look. But this is just because you do have provisions under the proposed housing, inclusionary zoning, and you have existing ones. Since there's no density measure per se, it's expected that a lot of that density can just be accommodated in whatever development's being proposed. But in the event that a developer maxes out their density on building type and everything else, and they still have development rights that they can use, this would allow the DRB to either allow for maybe a higher density housing type or an additional floor on something, or possibly a larger lot or a larger square footage to accommodate those additional units, but only to accommodate those additional units.
And is there a reason why they would not do that?
No, technically they would have to be able to do that under the other reg, under inclusionary zoning and the other regs. They would need to be able to accommodate those units. Right now, developers rarely build at the density they're allowed for a lot of different reasons, but in the event that they did, this would give them an out just for those purposes. You could also add some other incentives under this section at some point, but.
I would say that Ted's point, Sharon, of we should be clear about the sort of the maximum extent of that, so that there's no confusion that a a 4-story building can go in an area where the maximum was intended to be a 4-plex.
Well, that's why I listed the things there, but we could make that more explicit. Right now it says adjustments or modifications to the required housing mix, allowed housing types, or associated building lot or height standards to accommodate those extra units. But it's listed as an example. We can say those are it. That's what you're allowed to do.
Well, I think what I mean is not just what enables it, but how far it can go. How far outside of the standard things allowed in a TND could somebody do a 20-plex if normally the most that you can do is a 4-plex, for instance? Like giving the DRB some clarity as to the manners in which that would be could be achieved, because there's a big difference between allowing 4 buildings that each allow 2 more units in them versus 1 building that allows 20 more units in it.
That's true. But how many units are usually transferred under your regs?
Well, I don't want to get into the details. I just mean giving the board parameters.
Michael?
I have to get on another Zoom meeting in 4 minutes. So I don't know where we are right now, but it would be good if we could get to some point where we can pick it up again easily next time. I'll certainly send my comments to you and Paul, what I've written down in my homework, but I have to go in 4 minutes. So there was a question about minimum densities, and we discussed this before, and Paul had given a proposal that maybe a landowner, we're not talking about a developer now, we're talking about a landowner, and one of them came to one of our meetings and said he's got, I can't remember what it was, he's got 30 acres and he wants to give his children 3 1-acre lots where they can build the houses, and the remaining 27 acres is his, and he wants to leave it open. How do we deal with that?
Well, that goes sort of back to the question of a master plan versus a PUD. Certainly, yeah. I mean, you could say it's a PUD and require that for the portion that he develops that it meet the PUD standards for a TND, but it's hard to do if you're not developing it as a full TND. That you could borrow the building, and Paul and I have talked about at some point, the PUD standards were originally intended as something as an interim for redoing all your zoning districts. at some point in the future, you could apply housing types and street types and things to your underlying zoning. And you may not need a PUD section anymore, you know, if the underlying zoning.
That would be a simple subdivision that he would want to do.
Yeah, that would be, you know, that's what I would suggest, that would be a simple subdivision that you may require.
He called it a family compound, if I remember correctly. Okay, as long as we can accommodate it, that's fine. He owns it.
Monica?
I have a quick question that ties back to the density discussion you were explaining to Duncan. On page 3, and it's just to consider, on page 3, the point number 2 right below the chart talks about all PUD types are prohibited within the NRP. However, any PUD type may serve as a receiving area for transfer of development rights. That's where the math falls off for me. Because in the example you just gave, there is no density calculation. They can build as much as they can fit. So under what circumstances can they become a receiving area? And if they will never need to be a receiving area, why is that point there? And what do we do about TDRs? So that's where I just continue to be confused about the density and the math. And it's page 3, bullet 2, right under the chart. So just not for an answer tonight, but I'm missing that piece.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Monica.
Ted, did you have something?
No.
Well, I mean, it is 9:30, so I don't know if we're feeling like we're done. We kind of lost 2 of us. We still do have a quorum. So, Ernie?
I was just going to say, I think it sounded like Paul was pretty much wrapped up, unless Paul or Sharon had anything else.
I feel pretty good about our feedback, about the feedback you've given us. Monica's question's important. Duncan, your question about density, I couldn't agree more that we need to be able to explain this clearly to not just the commission, but to the public. And this is right at the top of my priority list of doing exactly that. And that sort of lends into, whenever you're ready, about the quick other business item I want to talk about, outreach stuff.
Are being rejected.
Sorry, what is the next step then? Because there are other little comments, but we don't even want to get into that now, right? Do you want to look at all of this and you'll be coming back to us again, and then we'll get into the...
I would love to, if in the next week or 10 days, say by not this weekend, but the following weekend, if commissioners could let me know what your questions and concerns are. I think that might be a more efficient way of going through all this. There are so many little bits of numbers in here that if we start going line by line, we'll spend months on this. Whereas I think if I can get, as Michael and if you have offered, I have a big question, I have a little question, we can frame those things out, and then we can have a more condensed discussion. And I think commissioners have indicated that you'd really like to get a draft out for public review also. So
yeah.
So if that sounds okay with you all, then that's how I'd recommend doing it.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. I think that's all I've got on that item then.
Thanks so much, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you guys. Good info.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yep.
Thanks, Sharon.
All right, you've got minutes and then a quick other business item.
I'll move to approve the minutes of
December 9th.
Of December the 9th.
Sorry, 8th. Excuse me, 8th.
As written. December the 8th as written.
Second. We all seconded it.
Second, third, and fourth.
Wait, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, so quickly, two quick things, one on scheduling, one on outreach. So scheduling wise, I had a good chat with Jessica last week. I am in a position where I think for your next meeting, I can give you a memo briefly summarizing the key other changes that you haven't seen, the sort of housekeeping stuff in the background of all this. I also have it drafted up in text, but in order to show it to you, I basically got to give you all 300 pages of the regulations. And Jessica thought she'd be nice to all of you and say, what if you gave us a memo outlining these things? And then if we have something that we want to talk about in more detail, we can see it. They're mostly housekeeping items, and there's a couple of things that I'll specifically flag for you of some good dialogue.
Paul, will the 300 pager be like available on the internet as current version or whatever? So if people did want to kind of on their own go in, they could do that?
I mean, it certainly will be available very soon for you. I just didn't want to sort of drop it all in your laps when you're still, next meeting is really going to be focused on wrapping up Article 12. And I didn't want you to feel like you had to read through 300 pages worth of stuff.
I agree with that. The memo is fine. I was just wondering, like, if anybody read the memo and wanted to refer to whatever paragraph you were talking about, is there a mechanism that they would be able to do that in case they had questions? And that way,
it's a fair question, Bernie. Let me think about. It's only a matter of time. Like, I've got it drafted, but there's still like little mop-ups to do. So. Yeah. It will absolutely be available. Whether I can have it for your next packet a week from tomorrow, I'm not sure. But
okay, and again, it doesn't necessarily need to go in the packet. I was more looking globally that if somebody read the memo on item whatever and they had a question, they could kind of read the actual text and figure it out on their own, and that might save time in the long run.
I'll see what I can do with that. It's a fair question. The outreach piece is, I've been getting some good feedback, and I imagine you have also, about how to quantify that which you've worked on, how much additional land is being conserved, what is the net effect on total amount of housing that can be built, that kind of thing. I think that we've come up with a way to measure that. There's too many variables to do it on a parcel by parcel basis. We're just gonna be so buried in assumptions that it would be too difficult. But I think that we can do some comparisons on either a zoning district level or on a sort of similar zoning district level, R2 to R4s, and give some useful numbers that still have a fair amount of assumptions baked into them. And the biggest is, one of the biggest challenges of talking about this with folks is, under the current rules, things like floodplains and wetlands and stream buffers, they count towards your density, or you get to count it as part of your density. But depending on your parcel, if you've got 1% of your parcel affected by those things, it probably doesn't in the end affect how much you can build. But if 90% of your parcel is a floodplain like the Belter Farm, it dramatically impacts what you can actually build. And so the mathematical number of what the theoretical density is sort of irrelevant. And so I think I want to try to do as best as possible apples to apples of what realistically can be built versus what the new regulations. One of, I think, the really strong points of them is that they self-calibrate, because you're getting higher density in the areas where you can build, and then we're leaving out the areas that you can't. So that's what I'm going to try to get out to you and others. What else are you hearing that you would like to see quantified for yourselves and for the public?
I mean, maybe there's an example of maybe an existing project that was already done that we could see what it would look like with the building-based Oh, I mean, I guess it's just hard to like picture what the difference
Yeah.
is. Building based versus like a number based density. Or I don't know if
Yeah.
it would be an existing project, but maybe just a theoretical layout or something.
And that was feedback, I think, Monica, that you'd shared came from the Affordable Housing Committee also. So I think I'd like to try to do that. So let me talk with our partners who are helping us with the graphics part of this and see what we can do, you know, without spending $80,000 to draw it.
Yeah,
Well,
you know, we had some nice examples for the block sizes, like the block layouts. I remember a couple months ago. I mean, maybe something just at that level of detail where we've got just some rectangles. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and I think just in general, where did this come up now? So many meetings. I guess it was an Affordable Housing Committee meeting. The comment that like what we're really doing here is we're trying to do better community building with what we're doing. And so once these are in place, there will not be a new development that is only single family housing, right? Because we're always in every PUD requiring a combination. Like, what are the big changes that people can expect? And that might be upsetting to some people that they're not going to anymore see a neighborhood that's only single family housing, but then we can explain why that's important. So those kind of those big, you know, under the premise of better community building, what are those key things that people will see from this? And if it's something that could be quantified or just very clearly explained.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
I think also, along with what Jessica said, and I think maybe that's what she's referring to, is that we see these maps and we see this green space or white space or whatever. But if we actually gave a number to what the maximum density now will be for particular parcels, like Marceau Meadows and, you know, whatever other places that are future buildable areas. So then people would see that there's going to be, you know, 200 homes here. So it won't be a surprise. They're fully aware that just south of Butler Farms, there may be 200 or 250 homes. But just a number that, because it doesn't mean it's going to be, but that's the maximum density, or you could say minimum maximum, but I think that would be helpful.
Well, and the corollary to that maybe would be, you know, whatever our current regulations are, kind of what could you do? And then with what we're proposing and, you know, the additional things we're setting aside and all that other stuff, what could you do and kind of what's the difference? Because I think that's, you know, one of the concerns certainly that I've heard is, you know, you're taking all this developable land off the table and, you know, we're not going to be able to build anything. And I don't really think that's the case. I mean, you know, we're conserving areas and we're doing some good stuff, but I think, you know, it might be useful to maybe just take an example parcel, and maybe it's one that's already developed. Maybe you take something like O'Brien's and you kind of say, well, what did O'Brien's look like, you know, before they put anything there, and, you know, what could they do? And then, you know, with where we are and what we're proposing, you know, what could be done, and kind of what's the delta on something like that. And, you know, maybe that's wishful thinking. I mean, that's probably a lot of work, but I think that gets to the root of what I've heard people are getting at is that, you know, what's the impact on, you know, how much less are we going to be able to build, or how many less affordable housing, or how many less or whatever, or more of whatever. So anyway.
Okay, I think that's really helpful. I think that what you're going to see based on what I've looked at thus far is that for properties that are largely buildable, so ones that aren't sort of in the outliers, you will likely see that the opportunities are for more housing, slightly, but in a more compact area. And so, you know, on balance, I think that's where it's going to be. There will be outliers in both directions to that. And that's where that gets a little bit tricky, but
that's important for people. I mean, you know, yeah, we're conserving, but you know, what we have is going to be tighter density and more compact. And so, you know, that's the trade-off to, you know, the other things that we're doing.
Right. And the last thing I would say on that, and then I'm happy to cede to Sandy, is there are, I would like to find a way to sort of talk about how these are sort of a package of things in terms of both conservation and development, but also that the blocks are relatively small in scale, but the way that the infrastructure to do that is afforded is because you can do compact building within those blocks. So it's not just 8 single-family homes that need to pay for the road in front of it. It's a multitude of homes, and so your everything becomes more compact, and and that's how you're able to, a developer, and then long-term the city is able to afford the infrastructure that supports it, that they both come together. And Jessica, Sandy's got her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Sandy.
I had to unmute myself. I'm just sort of tagging on to Monica and Bernie's comment because in addition to community, I think what you're focusing on is neighborhood and really creating rules that incentivize or maybe sort of require a more neighborhood type design as opposed to a sprawling subdivision that doesn't really function as a traditional neighborhood. And so that all goes with compactness, and that also goes with, as Paul said, less demand on city services. Because of the compactness, it uses less land. So to me, it's a win in just about every measure you want to put by it, and it gives developers an opportunity and really almost sort of demands with multiple housing types that they be more creative and think in that manner of neighborhood functioning. So that's my 10 cents.
Yeah, good. Good point.
Thanks, Sandy. Anybody else, or Paul, anything else on your update?
Just to say that Sandy added another comment in the chat, and I'll make sure that that gets in the minutes and encourage you all to read that, and a few other comments that were provided throughout the meeting. So I've asked Sue, as she's doing the minutes, to incorporate things that people write in the chat.
Very good. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I know this was a lot to get through. A good meeting.
Are we back to every 2 weeks now?
Yes, so the 26th will be your next meeting.
Cool.
Oh, while I've got you, I did have one more piece of news, and I'll tell Paul separately. Totally unrelated to the Planning Commission, mostly. I'm excited to report that my wife and I are expecting our first child.
Congratulations.
Oh,
yeah. Not that I didn't have a vested interest in this before.
From now on.
Was it planned?
You think you don't have time, Paul? Now wait till.
Is this one of the benefits of COVID-19?
Let's not get personal here. Come on.
Come on.
Anyway, so tax day, April 15th.
That's exciting. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. All right. On that note, I'm going to say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Night. Have a good sleep, Paul, because you can now.
While you can. Bye, everybody.
Right.